Welcome to Moonlit Inc. BL. A BL story written under moonlight. Let's begin. Chapter 1, The Ledger of Death. The iron-scented air of the imperial audience chamber was thick enough to choke a horse. Theo Pierce blinked, his vision swimming as the transition from dying in a cubicle over a caffeine-induced heart arrhythmia to kneeling on a cold stone floor completed its jarring download. Next, a voice boomed, cold, melodic, and utterly devoid of mercy. Theo looked up. At the far end of the hall, perched on a throne of obsidian and gold, sat Alexander Sycamore. He was more beautiful than the web novel had described, hair the color of a dying star and eyes like sharpened amethysts. He was also currently resting his chin on a hand stained with someone else's blood. Beside the throne stood Prince Melvin, looking like a concerned saint while wearing a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Brother," Melvin sighed, "the High Minister of Finance simply cannot find the missing 4 million gold crowns. It seems the treasury is leaking." "If it leaks," Alexander said, his voice dropping to a dangerous purr, "we plug the hole with the bodies of those responsible." "Executioner?" "Wait." The High Minister, a man who looked like a pile of melting butter, shrieked as a masked man stepped forward with an axe. "The math simply doesn't add up. It's magic. Curse work. Thwack. Theo flinched as the minister's head became a permanent subtraction from the room's population. The silence that followed was heavy. Theo looked down at the pile of parchment shoved into his own trembling hands. He was Theo, a low-level clerk whose only job was to hold the backup ledgers. According to the original plot, the clerk was usually executed next just to keep the records clean. "You," Alexander pointed a gloved finger at Theo. "The little one with the glasses. You're the assistant. Can you find the 4 million, or should I save time and have the executioner stay in position?" Theo's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked at the ledger. Years of auditing crooked corporate firms kicked in. His eyes scanned the columns. His brain, wired for the soul-crushing complexity of modern tax law, saw the discrepancy instantly. It wasn't magic. It was a classic, amateur-hour shell game. "Your Highness," Theo said, his voice cracking before he found his professional auditor register. He stood up, ignored the gasp of the court, and marched toward the throne. "Stay back, peasant," a guard barked, leveling a spear. "Let him come," Alexander murmured, his interest piqued by the sheer audacity of a man not currently voiding his bladder in fear. Theo stopped 3 steps from the prince. He flipped the ledger open and pointed to a series of grain procurement entries from the northern provinces. "The High Minister wasn't stealing your money, Your Highness. He was just an idiot who didn't understand double-entry bookkeeping." Melvin's expression flickered. "Explain yourself, clerk." "The missing 4 million isn't missing," Theo said, his sharp tongue getting ahead of his survival instinct. "It was redirected into a ghost fund for emergency border fortifications that don't exist, then laundered back through the royal stables' hay budget. Also, whoever wrote this page has the handwriting of a caffeinated squirrel and forgot to carry the one in the 3rd column." Theo looked up, realizing he had just insulted the entire financial history of the Estary Empire. Alexander leaned forward, his face inches from Theo's. The prince smelled of sandalwood and impending doom. "A caffeinated squirrel?" "A very frantic one, sire," Theo clarified, sweating. "But if you execute me, you'll never find the paper trail leading to the offshore, the secret provincial vaults where that money is currently sitting. It's about 4.2 million, actually. You're over-budgeting for your own tyranny." The hall was so silent you could hear a pin drop. Melvin looked like he wanted to swallow his own tongue. Alexander stared at Theo for a long, agonizing minute. Then, he began to laugh. It wasn't a kind laugh, it was the sound of a predator finding a particularly interesting new toy. "You're small," Alexander mused, reaching out to tilt Theo's chin up with a cold finger. But your tongue is very sharp. And your eyes, they aren't looking at the axe. They're looking at my math. Bad math is the real villain here, sire, Theo muttered. I like you, Alexander decided, the obsession sparking in his eyes like a forest fire. The minister is dead. You are now my private secretary. If you find the 4.2 million, I'll give you a villa. If you're wrong by even a single copper. I know. My head goes on the pile, Theo sighed, already mentally reorganizing the prince's filing system. Can I at least get a decent quill? This one is shedding. Alexander's grin widened, dark and delighted. Anything you want, little secretary. As long as you never leave my sight. Theo shivered. He had fixed the budget, but he had a feeling his personal time was about to become a deficit he could never repay. Chapter 2, First Day on the Job, Don't Get Murdered. Theo's new bedroom was less of a sleeping quarter and more of a gilded cage with a very high thread count. It was located in the West Wing, directly adjacent to the Crown Prince's chambers, a proximity that Theo found geographically threatening. The previous secretary stayed in the servants' barracks, a terrified maid whispered as she dropped off a stack of silk tunics. But His Highness insisted you be within shouting distance. Shouting distance or stabbing distance? Theo muttered, already sat at a mahogany desk he'd commandeered before breakfast. He wasn't looking at the view of the rose gardens, he was staring at a stack of requisition forms that made his eyes bleed. By 9 a.m., the door to his office, which was really just an alcove in Alexander's massive study, slammed open. Crown Prince Alexander Sycamore entered like a localized hurricane. He wasn't wearing his formal armor today, just a loose black shirt unbuttoned halfway down his chest, looking entirely too attractive for a man who had decapitated a minister less than 24 hours ago. Secretary, Alexander drawled, leaning over Theo's shoulder. The scent of sandalwood and cold rain hit Theo instantly. You aren't dead yet. I'm impressed. I'm too busy to die, Your Highness, Theo said, not looking up from a parchment. Did you know you spent 60,000 gold crowns last month on intimidation decor? Alexander paused, his hand resting on the back of Theo's chair, his fingers dangerously close to the nape of Theo's neck. It was a collection of spiked maces for the foyer. It sets the tone for visiting ambassadors. It sets the tone for bankruptcy, Theo countered, finally looking up. He didn't flinch at the prince's predatory gaze. Instead, he held up a red-inked sheet. I've vetoed the order for the obsidian gargoyles. We're diverting those funds to the public sanitation department in the lower district. Alexander's eyes narrowed into violet slits. You vetoed me? In the corner of the room, a royal guard audibly gasped and began praying. I vetoed the expense, Theo corrected, tapping his quill against his chin. Unless you want to lead an army that is currently dying of dysentery. A sickly army can't occupy neighboring territories, sire. It's basic ROI, return on investment. Alexander stared at him. No one spoke to him like this. People usually stuttered, wept, or fainted. But this small, sharp-tongued man was looking at him like he was a budget deficit that needed fixing. It was infuriating. It was exhilarating. You have a very strange way of speaking, Theo Pierce, Alexander murmured, leaning in so close their noses almost touched. Roy? Investment? You sound like a man from another world. Theo's heart did a nervous little tap dance. Technically, I am, Theo thought, but he couldn't say that out loud. I just have a functional brain, Your Highness. Speaking of brains, your brother is outside. As if on cue, Prince Melvin strolled in, wearing a smile that was far too bright for the gloomy palace. Brother. I see you've kept the little clerk. How charming. I came to discuss the new palace expansion in the south. I've already hired the contractors. Theo felt a headache forming. He checked his black ledger, the one he was keeping on Melvin's suspicious activities. The South expansion? You mean the one located on a floodplain that will sink within 3 years? Or the one where the contractors are actually your own shell companies, Prince Melvin? Melvin's smile faltered for a microsecond. I beg your pardon. I ran the numbers, Theo said, standing up and tucking his quill behind his ear. The cost of marble is inflated by 40%. You're skimming off the top, and you're doing it poorly. It's offensive, really. If you're going to embezzle, at least make the math plausible. Alexander's expression shifted from boredom to lethal amusement. He looked at his brother, then back at Theo, his hand moving to rest possessively on Theo's waist. The touch was heavy, warm, and sent a jolt of pure electricity through Theo's spine. Is this true, Melvin? Alexander asked, his voice a low, vibrating warning. He's just a clerk, Alexander. He's confused. Melvin stammered. He doesn't look confused, Alexander said, pulling Theo a fraction of an inch closer. He looks like he's doing your job better than you are. Leave. Now. Before I decide to audit your head next. Melvin scrambled out of the room, his face a mask of humiliated rage. Theo let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. You shouldn't threaten your brother like that. It creates workplace toxicity. Workplace, what? Alexander laughed, a genuine, dark sound. He didn't let go of Theo's waist. You are a fascinating creature, Theo. You just humiliated a prince of the blood because his math was offensive? Laziness is the only true sin, sire, Theo muttered, trying, and failing, to ignore how large Alexander's hand felt against him. Is that so? Alexander leaned down, his lips brushing against Theo's ear. Then I shall have to be very diligent in my observations of you. Work as much as you like, secretary. But don't think for a second that your ledgers will protect you from me. Alexander pulled away with a wicked smirk, leaving Theo standing in the middle of the office, his heart rate currently exceeding all safe imperial limits. Theo looked at the door, then back at his papers. Great, he whispered to the empty room. I've saved the treasury, but I've definitely ended up on the obsessive villain watch list. I need a vacation. Or a raise. Preferably both. Chapter 3, The Grain Shipment Gambit. The audit of Estary hit its first major snag on a Tuesday. Theo was hunched over a map of the Empire's northern trade routes, his glasses sliding down his nose as he compared two sets of conflicting shipping manifests. 40 tons, Theo muttered, stabbing a finger at a parchment. 40 tons of premium wheat just evaporated between the Mauritius granaries and the capital. It didn't go to the famine-stricken north, and it didn't arrive at the imperial kitchens. Perhaps it was stolen by bandits, a smooth, terrifying voice suggested. Theo didn't even jump. He was becoming dangerously accustomed to Alexander Sycamore's habit of appearing behind him like a beautiful, lethal poltergeist. The prince was leaning against the heavy oak doorframe, watching Theo with an intensity that suggested he found the sight of a stressed accountant more entertaining than a gladiator match. Bandits don't sign delivery receipts with a forged seal of the Ministry of Interior, sire, Theo said, not looking back. This was a legalized heist. Your brother, Melvin, is managing the relief efforts, which in this case means he's selling the Empire's food to the black market and letting the peasants starve to make you look like an incompetent tyrant. Alexander's playfulness vanished. He crossed the room in 3 strides, his shadow stretching long across the floor. He is playing with the lives of my subjects to weaken my throne. He's playing with the bottom line, Theo corrected, finally turning around. If the North revolts, tax revenue drops by 20%, and the cost of military suppression will bankrupt the summer treasury. It's a fiscal nightmare. Alexander reached out, his thumb brushing a smudge of ink off Theo's cheek. The gesture was surprisingly tender, though his eyes remained cold as ice. Then tell me, my clever little bird. How do we kill him for this? We don't kill him. Not yet, Theo said, his heart skipping a beat at the touch. We use modern logistics. And a bit of psychological warfare. The following morning, the capital's largest black market grain wholesalers were summoned to the palace. They expected to be executed. Instead, they found themselves in a room with a very tired-looking secretary and a very bored-looking crown prince who was casually sharpening a dagger. Gentlemen, Theo began, standing before a large chalkboard he'd forced the palace carpenters to build. I've been reviewing your charitable acquisitions. It seems you've accidentally come into possession of 40 tons of imperial grain. The merchants looked at Prince Melvin, who was sitting in the corner, his face pale. It was a legitimate purchase, one merchant stammered. Oh, I'm sure, Theo smiled, a sharp, predatory expression that almost mirrored Alexander's. However, I've just instituted a new, emergency grain audit tax. It's roughly 300% of the value of any grain held without a primary imperial license. By my calculations, you all owe the crown enough money to buy the palace. Twice. This is madness. Melvin stood up. You can't just invent taxes. I can when the crown prince signs the decree, Theo said, holding up a piece of parchment. Alexander didn't even look up from his dagger. I signed it. I didn't read it, because I trust my secretary, but I signed it with my very sharpest pen. Theo turned back to the merchants. Now, I'm a reasonable man. I'm willing to waive the 300% tax if the grain is discovered and delivered to the northern provinces within 48 hours. We'll even call it a patriotic donation. You get to keep your heads, the North gets to eat, and Melvin gets to explain why his legitimate business partners are suddenly so generous. The merchants scrambled out of the room so fast they nearly tripped over their own robes. Late that night, Theo was still at his desk, his head resting on his arms. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving him in a puddle of exhaustion. The candles had burned low, casting flickering amber light across the room. He felt a heavy, fur-lined cloak being draped over his shoulders. You are a very strange man, Theo Pierce, Alexander whispered. He didn't pull away this time. He sat on the edge of the desk, forcing Theo to look up at him. The problem is solved, sire, Theo croaked, his voice thick with sleep. The grain is moving. The budget is balanced. I don't care about the grain, Alexander murmured. He reached down, his hand cupping Theo's face, his thumb tracing the line of Theo's lower lip. I watched you today. You dismantled a conspiracy with a piece of chalk and a smile. You were more terrifying than I've ever been. Theo's breath hitched. I was just doing my job. No, Alexander's voice dropped to a low, possessive vibration. You were protecting my empire. My throne. Me. He leaned down, his forehead resting against Theo's. Everyone else wants something from me. My brother wants my crown. The ministers want my favor. But you just want me to use a better pen. It really is a terrible pen, Alexander, Theo whispered, unable to pull away from the magnetic pull of the prince's gaze. You're exhausted, Alexander noted, his eyes dark with a fixation that was quickly turning from professional to something far more treacherous. You will sleep here tonight. In my chambers. I find I don't like the idea of you being alone where Melvin's accidents might find you. That's highly irregular for a secretary, Theo managed to say, even as Alexander stood up and effortlessly lifted him into his arms. You aren't just a secretary anymore, Theo, Alexander said, carrying him toward the inner chambers. You're the only person in this palace I can't afford to lose. And I never, ever lose my assets. As Theo's head hit the suspiciously soft pillows of the crown prince's bed, he had a terrifying thought. He had fixed the famine, but he had accidentally made himself the most sought-after commodity in Estary. Chapter 4, The Obsession Begins. Theo woke up in the crown prince's bed, alone, thankfully, but surrounded by the scent of expensive incense and looming consequences. By the time he reached his desk, he found it had been moved. It was no longer in the alcove. It was now positioned exactly 3 feet away from Alexander's own massive workstation, angled so that if the prince tilted his head even slightly, he could watch Theo breathe. "Sire," Theo said, eyeing the new floor plan. "This is a fire hazard. And a distraction." "It's supervision, Theo," Alexander replied without looking up from a map. He was draped over his chair with a predatory grace, a single gold earring catching the morning light. "I've decided your safety is the Empire's highest priority. Therefore, you will remain within my line of sight at all times." "I am an accountant, not a puppy," Theo muttered, sat down, and began aggressively stabbing at an inkwell. The comedy of the situation peaked around noon. Theo was trying to draft a new policy on military pension reform when he realized Alexander wasn't working. The prince was simply leaning his head on his hand, staring at Theo. "For 20 minutes. Is there something on my face?" Theo finally snapped, his quill trembling. "Ink," Alexander said softly. "On your jaw." Theo reached up to wipe it, but Alexander was faster. He leaned across the narrow gap between their desks, his thumb grazing Theo's skin. The contact was electric, lingering far longer than a simple smudge removal required. Alexander's violet eyes searched Theo's, looking for a crack in his professional armor. "You have a very rhythmic way of writing," Alexander murmured. "It's soothing. It's the sound of me trying to ignore the fact that you're burning a hole in my skull with your eyes," Theo countered. "Don't you have a war to plan? A rebellion to squash? A villainous monologue to practice?" "I'd rather watch you find another 4 million crowns, Alexander teased, his voice dropping to that dangerous, intimate register. "It's much more impressive." The fluff was interrupted by a knock at the door. A terrified page entered, carrying a bouquet of rare, blue lilies, the traditional flower of the Estary nobility. For the secretary," the page squeaked. "From Prince Melvin." A gesture of reconciliation for the misunderstanding with the grain. The temperature in the room plummeted 20 degrees. Alexander's hand, which had been playfully drumming on the desk, curled into a fist. "How thoughtful," Alexander said, his voice as sharp as a guillotine blade. "Theo, do you like lilies?" Theo looked at the flowers, then at the murder in Alexander's eyes. "They're fine, I guess. Though the pollen is a nightmare for." Before Theo could finish, Alexander stood up, took the bouquet from the page, and tossed it out the window. The 3-story drop into the moat was a clear statement of intent. "You're allergic," Alexander lied smoothly, turning back to the trembling page. "Tell my brother that if he wishes to communicate with my secretary, he can do so through official, stamped paperwork. If he sends so much as a dandelion again, I'll have his gardening staff drafted into the vanguard." The page fled. Theo stared at the empty space where the flowers had been. "That was a bit much, don't you think?" "He is trying to buy you, Theo," Alexander growled, stalking toward him. He trapped Theo against the back of his chair, pinning him in with both arms. The prince's obsession was no longer a subtle shadow, it was a physical weight. "He sees you as a piece on a board. He wants your mind so he can take my crown." "And you?" Theo asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What do you see me as?" Alexander leaned down, his breath warm against Theo's lips. For a second, Theo thought the mildly treacherous fixation was about to become a full-blown crisis. "I see you as the only thing in this rotting palace that isn't for sale," Alexander whispered. "Which makes you priceless. And I don't share my treasures, Theo. Not with my brother, and certainly not with the world." He pulled back just as Theo's brain was beginning to melt, a smug, dark smirk returning to his face. "Now, back to the pension reform. I want to see how you plan to pay for it without taxing my personal wine budget." Theo sat there, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He picked up his quill, but his hands were shaking. He had successfully restructured the government, but he was starting to realize that managing the obsessive whims of a tyrannical prince was a full-time job, one that didn't include a retirement plan. Chapter 5, The Social Audit, The Grand Ball. If there was one thing Theo Pierce hated more than a disorganized spreadsheet, it was a social obligation that required him to wear silk. "I look like a glorified curtain," Theo grumbled, tugging at the high, stiff collar of his formal midnight blue tunic. The fabric was heavy with silver embroidery, patterns of vines and thorns that looked suspiciously like the Sycamore crest. "You look," Alexander's voice drifted from the shadows of the dressing room, "like someone I would execute a man for touching." The crown prince stepped into the light, and Theo's breath hitched. Alexander was a vision of lethal elegance in charcoal and crimson, his hair swept back to reveal the sharp, cruel lines of a face that was currently softened by a look of terrifying possessiveness. He walked toward Theo, his boots clicking rhythmically on the marble floor. "The Grand Ball is a den of vipers, Theo," Alexander murmured, reaching out to straighten Theo's silver sash. His fingers lingered at Theo's waist, his touch firm. "The nobility will try to provoke you. They see a commoner secretary as a stain on the court. They think you are a weakness I've developed." Theo adjusted his glasses, trying to reclaim his professional dignity. "I've audited the national debt, sire. A few powdered aristocrats with fragile egos don't scare me. Besides, I have the ultimate weapon." Alexander arched a dark eyebrow. "A dagger? Poison?" "A list of everyone's outstanding property taxes," Theo said with a thin, wicked smile. The ballroom was a dizzying swirl of gold leaf, orchestral strings, and enough perfume to knock out a draft horse. As Theo followed Alexander down the grand staircase, a hush fell over the crowd. It wasn't just the prince's presence, it was the fact that he wasn't accompanied by a high-born lady or a general. He was walking half a step ahead of a small man with a sharp gaze and an even sharper suit. Prince Melvin was already there, holding court near the punch bowl. He looked remarkably composed for a man who had recently lost a grain-smuggling empire. "Brother," Melvin hailed them, his eyes immediately darting to Theo. "And the industrious Master Pierce. I was so sorry to hear about your allergy to lilies. I hope your health has improved." "My health is excellent, Prince Melvin," Theo replied, his voice carrying just enough administrative coldness. "Though I'm concerned about yours. I noticed a 15% discrepancy in the maintenance records for your summer villa. Stress can be so hard on the memory." Melvin's smile twitched. A few nearby nobles whispered behind their fans. "Theo," Alexander interrupted, his voice a low warning. But he wasn't angry. He looked delighted. He leaned down, whispering loudly enough for the surrounding gossips to hear, "Don't waste your brilliance on the minor accounts tonight. Save it for me." The social audit turned into a battlefield. Every time a countess tried to pull Alexander away for a dance, he would pivot the conversation back to Theo. Every time a duke tried to belittle Theo's rank, Alexander's hand would drop to the hilt of his sword, his gaze turning predatory. By midnight, the air had grown stifling. Theo slipped away to a secluded balcony, leaning his head against the cool stone. The moon over Estary was huge and silver, reflecting in the palace moat below. "The ledger says we should be heading back to the office soon," Theo muttered to the night air. "The ledger is closed for the night," Alexander said, appearing in the doorway. He didn't stay by the door. He moved into Theo's space, trapping him between the balcony rail and his own body. The music from the ballroom was a faint, melodic hum. Here, in the moonlight, the crown prince didn't look like a villain or a tyrant. He looked like a man who was starving for something that couldn't be bought or conquered. "They were all staring at you," Alexander whispered, his hands coming up to rest on the stone on either side of Theo's head. "I wanted to gouge their eyes out. I wanted to scream that you are the only person who sees me, not the crown, not the blood, but me. Theo's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Alexander. I'm just your secretary. No, Alexander breathed, leaning down until their foreheads touched. You are the one who told me my math was offensive. You are the one who saved my people while I was busy looking for someone to kill. You reorganized my empire, Theo. Did you think I'd let you reorganize your way out of my life? He didn't kiss him, not yet. The tension was a living thing, thick and treacherous. Alexander simply stood there, his violet eyes tracing every line of Theo's face with an obsessive hunger. I have a contract, Theo managed to squeak out, though his hands had instinctively found purchase on the lapels of Alexander's coat. I'll rewrite it, Alexander promised, his voice a dark, velvet vow. I'll make it a permanent engagement. No resignations. No exits. Just us, and a very, very long audit. Before Theo could respond, a scream echoed from the ballroom inside. The obsessive tension was shattered by the sound of breaking glass and the frantic shouting of guards. The trap had been sprung. Chapter 6, The Trap is Sprung. The transition from a moonlit balcony to a damp, torchlit dungeon was a fiscal downturn Theo hadn't prepared for. That the discrepancy had occurred with terrifying speed. One moment, Alexander was promising to rewrite Theo's contract, the next, Prince Melvin had stormed the ballroom with the Imperial Guard, brandishing a series of intercepted documents. The accusation was as classic as it was lazy: embezzlement. Specifically, that Theo had used his modern logistics to siphon millions into a private account in a neighboring kingdom. I have the ledger right here, brother. Melvin had shouted, his face a mask of performative grief. The clerk you trusted has been bleeding Estary dry. Alexander had looked ready to burn the palace down, but Theo, seeing the surrounding spears, had simply raised his hands. It's fine, Alexander. It's just an audit. A very aggressive audit. Now, Theo sat on a pile of straw that definitely didn't meet health and safety standards. He wasn't crying, though. He was using a piece of charcoal from a burnt torch to write complex equations on the stone wall. The heavy iron door groaned open. Theo didn't look up. If you're here to execute me, please wait. I'm almost finished calculating the depreciation of the dungeon's structural integrity. I'm not here to execute you, a voice growled. Theo froze. It wasn't the executioner. It was Alexander. The crown prince was covered in dust and blood, not his own, presumably, and he looked absolutely feral. He had bypassed the guards, likely by being more terrifying than the prospect of treason. Alexander? You shouldn't be here, Theo said, dropping the charcoal. Melvin is trying to link us. If you're seen visiting the traitor, he'll use it to claim you were in on the embezzlement. Alexander ignored him, reaching through the bars to grab Theo's collar, pulling him flush against the cold iron. His eyes were bloodshot, his violet iris eclipsed by pupils blown wide with a frantic, obsessive heat. Do you think I care about a throne? Alexander hissed, his breath hitching. They took you from my side. They put you in the dark. I have spent the last 3 hours deciding which limb to take from Melvin first. Don't, Theo said, his voice soft but firm. He reached through the bars, his fingers brushing against Alexander's trembling hand. If you kill him now, you're just the villain prince the story wants you to be. You'll be a tyrant without a secretary. And I refuse to work for a dead man or a king in exile. Alexander's grip tightened. He framed you, Theo. He used your own system against you. He tried to, Theo corrected with a small, tired smirk. But Melvin is an amateur. He forged my signature on a transfer of funds dated the 14th. I was in your office on the 14th, Alexander. For 18 hours. With you. Alexander paused, his murderous rage flickering into a confused realization. Yes. You were. You fell asleep on the map of the Western Reach. Exactly. An alibi provided by the Crown Prince himself is a high-yield asset, Theo explained, his professional calm returning. But more importantly, I didn't just keep one set of books. I knew Melvin would try something like this the moment I touched the grain shipments. I have a second, hidden ledger buried under the floorboards of the stable, the real records of every copper Melvin has stolen for the last 5 years. Alexander stared at him. The tension in his shoulders didn't leave, but it changed. It shifted from the desire to destroy everything to a terrifying, dark pride. He leaned his forehead against the bars, closing his eyes. You knew, Alexander whispered. You stepped into the dungeon as a tactical move. It was the most efficient way to get him to stop hiding his assets and start bragging about them, Theo admitted. But I would really like to leave now. This straw is definitely giving me a rash. Alexander let out a sharp, jagged laugh. He reached into his belt, pulled out a heavy iron key, and unlocked the cell door with a violent twist. As the door swung open, he didn't just let Theo out, he caught him, hauling him up against his chest in a crushing embrace. You are a dangerous, brilliant, maddening man, Alexander muttered into Theo's hair. I should lock you in my rooms and never let you see the sun again just to keep my heart rate stable. That would be a gross misuse of human resources, Theo muffled into the prince's shoulder, though he didn't pull away. The obsessive weight of Alexander's hold was the only thing keeping him grounded. Let's go, Theo, Alexander said, pulling back to look at him with a look that promised a very bloody morning for the rest of the court. The audit is over. It's time for the hostile takeover. Chapter 7, The Hostile Takeover. The imperial court had never seen a hostile takeover that involved so little blood and so much paperwork. Prince Melvin was in the middle of his victory speech, standing before the high ministers and the cowering remains of the nobility. And so, Melvin proclaimed, gesturing to the forged ledgers on the central dais, with the traitorous secretary secured, we must now look to the crown prince's own negligence. If he cannot oversee his own staff, how can he oversee? The heavy oak doors of the chamber didn't just open, they were kicked off their hinges. Alexander strode in, looking like a god of war who had recently developed a taste for litigation. He wasn't alone. Theo followed behind him, looking slightly worse for wear with straw in his hair and ink on his fingers, but carrying a battered, leather-bound book like it was a holy relic. Brother, Alexander's voice echoed, cold and vibrating with a lethal sort of glee. I believe you've reached the part of the meeting where we discuss accountability. Melvin's face went the color of curdled milk. Alexander? You should be in mourning for your reputation. Guard. Why is the prisoner free? The guards hesitated, looking from the villain prince to the benevolent one. They chose to look at the floor. Theo stepped forward, adjusting his glasses. The room fell into a stunned silence. Actually, Prince Melvin, according to the Imperial Code, Section 4, Paragraph 12, a prisoner may be released for emergency fact-checking if the evidence provided is found to be mathematically impossible. Theo slapped the battered ledger onto the central table. It landed with a thud that sounded like a coffin lid closing. This, Theo announced, is the actual record of the Estary treasury. Not the one you edited, and certainly not the one the late minister was too lazy to check. I've spent the last 3 hours, and 5 years of your past, reconciling your private interests. That book is a lie. Melvin shrieked, reaching for it. Alexander's hand moved faster than sight, pinning Melvin's wrist to the table with the flat of a dagger. Don't touch the evidence, Melvin. My secretary worked very hard on those columns. Theo began to read. It was a rhythmic, soul-crushing litany of greed. He detailed the ghost funds, the redirected grain, the kickbacks from the South Palace project, and, the final nail in the coffin, the secret payments to a foreign mercenary group meant to stabilize the capital after Alexander was deposed. With every number Theo spoke, the ministers retreated from Melvin's side. In the world of Estary, you could forgive a prince for being a murderer, but you could never forgive him for being a thief who got caught. The total amount embezzled over 5 fiscal years, Theo concluded, looking Melvin dead in the eye, is 12.8 million gold crowns. Enough to fund the Empire's education system for a decade. Or, in your case, enough to fund a one-way trip to the northern tundra. You little rat. Melvin lunged at Theo, his face twisted in a desperate rage. He didn't get within 2 feet. Alexander moved with the terrifying fluidness of a tiger, catching Melvin by the throat and lifting him off the ground. The obsession that usually burned for Theo was now channeled into a cold, focused destruction. You took my grain, Alexander whispered, his voice a low snarl. You took my money. But you made the mistake of trying to take my strategist. You put him in a cell, Melvin. You made him sleep on straw. Alexander, wait, Theo started, but the prince wasn't listening. The audit is complete, Alexander declared to the room. Prince Melvin is stripped of his title, his lands, and his head. No, Theo interrupted, stepping into Alexander's space and placing a hand on the prince's arm. It was the only thing that could have stopped the killing blow. Execution is a one-time expense. It doesn't recover the assets. Alexander paused, his eyes still wild, his grip on Melvin's throat tightening. What are you suggesting, Theo? Asset seizure and lifelong labor in the northern mines, Theo said, his sharp tongue finally getting the last word. Let him spend the rest of his life doing the math of how much he owes the state. It's a much higher ROI. Alexander looked at Melvin, broken, sobbing, and utterly defeated, and then back at Theo. A dark, proud smile spread across the prince's face. He dropped Melvin like a sack of unwanted grain. You heard the secretary, Alexander announced. Take him away. I have a kingdom to rebuild, and apparently, a very expensive secretary to pay. As the guards dragged Melvin out, the court erupted into a chaotic attempt to swear loyalty to Alexander. But Alexander didn't care about the ministers. He turned to Theo, his gaze softening into that intense, possessive fixation that always made Theo's pulse spike. The Empire is clean, Theo, Alexander murmured, stepping close enough to shield him from the eyes of the court. But you mentioned a hostile takeover. We haven't finished that part yet. Theo blinked. I meant the government, sire. I didn't, Alexander replied, his hand sliding up to cup Theo's jaw. The government is a hobby. This is the takeover. Chapter 8, The Permanent Contract. The post-coup paperwork was, in Theo's professional opinion, a nightmare of epic proportions. 3 weeks had passed since Melvin's exile to the mines. The Empire of Estary was breathing again. The grain was flowing, the tax codes were being rewritten, and the villain prince was being hailed as a visionary reformer, mostly because Theo was ghostwriting his edicts. Theo sat in the sun-drenched office, his bags packed and tucked discreetly behind a velvet curtain. He had done what he came to do. The empire was fixed, the villain was redeemed, mostly, and the plot had been thoroughly derailed. According to the Transmigration handbook, in his head, this was the part where the protagonist retired to a quiet villa to live off his dividends. The door creaked open. Alexander entered, not with his usual hurricane force, but with a slow, deliberate stride. He wasn't wearing his crown. He was wearing a simple white shirt and the silver-embroidered sash Theo had worn to the ball. The Northern Lords have signed the new trade agreement, Alexander said, leaning against Theo's desk. He looked tired, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. They called the interest rates predatory. I told them they were. Theo approved. Theo managed a small, tight smile. They'll thank me when their infrastructure doesn't collapse in 5 years. Speaking of which, sire. Theo reached into his desk and pulled out a single, perfectly formatted sheet of parchment. My final report. And my resignation. The air in the room didn't just turn cold, it vanished. Alexander didn't take the paper. He didn't even look at it. He kept his eyes locked on Theo's. Resignation. You're leaving. The contract was to fix the corruption, Theo said, his voice steadier than he felt. The corruption is gone. The budget is balanced. You don't need a secretary anymore, Alexander. You need a chancellor, a council, and, eventually, a consort from a powerful house. I don't recall authorizing a retirement plan, Alexander whispered. He reached out, his hand moving with agonizing slowness to pick up the resignation letter. Theo watched as the prince's long, elegant fingers gripped the parchment. Then, with a casual flick of his wrist, Alexander held the paper over the candle on the desk. The flame licked the edges, turning the permanent resignation into permanent ash in seconds. That was high-quality vellum, Theo deadpanned, though his heart was thundering. I'm a tyrant, Theo. Did you forget? Alexander stepped around the desk, forcing Theo to stand. He didn't stop until Theo was backed against the window, the afternoon sun casting a golden halo around them. You think you can just balance my books and walk away? You've made me addicted to your logic. I can't even execute a traitor anymore without wondering if the ROI is sufficient. You'll learn, Theo breathed. No. Alexander's hands came up, framing Theo's face, his thumbs tracing the line of his cheekbones with a desperate, heavy warmth. I won't. I spent my life waiting for someone to try and take my crown. I never expected someone to come along and make the crown worth wearing. He leaned down, his forehead resting against Theo's. The obsessive tension that had been building for 8 chapters finally reached its breaking point. I have a new contract, Alexander murmured. It's a merger. Total integration of assets. Alexander. You want a quiet life? I'll build you a villa in every province. You want a raise? Take the treasury. But you are staying. Not as a secretary. Not as a pawn. Alexander pulled back just enough to look Theo in the eye, his gaze burning with a fierce, possessive hope. Be my prince consort. Audit my life. Tell me my math is offensive until the day I die. Theo looked at the man who had gone from a cold-blooded killer to a man who burnt his resignation papers out of love. He thought about the boring cubicle he had left behind and the vibrant, dangerous, beautiful mess he was standing in now. I have conditions, Theo said, his sharp tongue returning even as he reached up to wrap his arms around Alexander's neck. I want weekends off. No executions on Sundays. And I get final approval on all intimidation decor. Alexander laughed, a bright, genuine sound that echoed through the palace. I'm being colonized by a bureaucrat. It's called a hostile takeover, sire, Theo whispered. Alexander leaned in, finally sealing the contract with a kiss that was neither mild nor professional. It was deep, possessive, and promised a lifetime of very complicated bookkeeping. Theo Pierce had transmigrated to fix an empire, but as Alexander pulled him closer, he realized he had accidentally acquired the only asset that truly mattered. The audit was over. The ledger was closed. And for the first time in 2 worlds, Theo's heart was perfectly balanced.